David Malongu stood in front of 200 people, his wife's mocking words still echoing in the room. His hands trembled. His heart pounded. For 15 years, he had been silent. For 15 years, he had swallowed every insult, every humiliation, every casual cruelty. But on this day, something inside him broke. When he opened his mouth to speak, his voice was quiet. Just one word. Enough. That single word would shatter his marriage, divide his community, and start a revolution that would change Khayelitsha Township forever. This is his story. But it's also the story of every man who forgot he had a voice. And every woman who forgot that power without compassion is just another form of cruelty. Before we begin, if you believe everyone deserves respect regardless of who earns more money, smash that like button right now and subscribe to Folktales by Inayah. Drop a quick comment. Respect goes both ways. Let's see how many of us believe in true equality. Now, let's go back to where it all started. The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty streets of Khayelitsha Township, where the zinc roofs gleamed like silver coins scattered across the landscape. Inside the modest brick house on Mango Street, David Malongu stood at the kitchen counter, his calloused hands trembling slightly as he poured tea into 3 mismatched cups. The aroma of rooibos filled the small space, but it did little to calm the knot tightening in his stomach. "You call this tea?" Grace's voice cut through the morning quiet like a blade. His wife of 15 years sat at the table, her arms crossed over her chest, her lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Even a child could make better tea than this useless man I married." David said nothing. He had learned years ago that silence was his shield, his armor against the daily barrage of words that seemed designed to strip away whatever dignity he had left. He simply added more sugar to her cup, the way she liked it, and set it before her with steady hands. Their neighbor, Sarah, sat beside Grace, nodding in agreement. "Men," she scoffed, examining her perfectly manicured nails. "They're all the same. My Thomas burnt the pap last night." "Burnt it? I told him he's as useful as a chocolate teapot." She laughed, a sharp sound that made David's jaw tighten imperceptibly. Grace joined in the laughter. "At least Thomas can hold down a job. This one," she gestured dismissively at David without looking at him, "barely makes enough to keep the lights on. I should have married Jonas Ndlovu when I had the chance. His wife drives a BMW now." David moved to the sink, washing the dishes from breakfast with methodical precision. Through the window, he could see other men in the township going about their morning routines, some heading to construction sites, others to taxi ranks, all carrying the same weighted silence he knew too well. In Khayelitsha, and in townships across South Africa, this had become the unspoken arrangement. Successful women, empowered by their jobs in offices and schools, had inverted the old power structures, and some wielded their newfound authority like a weapon. "Did you even hear me?" Grace's voice rose sharply. "I said we need money for my mother's Umembiso ceremony next week. 2,000 rand. And don't tell me we don't have it. I know you got paid yesterday." "The rent," David began quietly. "The rent can wait. My family's honor cannot wait. Or are you saying my family isn't important to you?" Sarah leaned forward conspiratorially. "You know what I tell Thomas? I tell him if he can't provide, then he shouldn't speak. Simple as that." She snapped her fingers for emphasis. David dried his hands on a faded dish towel, his dark eyes reflecting something that might have been pain or might have been the beginning of something else entirely. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered from years of construction work, but he carried himself with the hunched posture of someone trying to take up less space in the world. "I'll figure something out," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Grace waved him away dismissively. "You better. I'm not going to my mother's ceremony looking like a pauper because my husband can't provide." She turned to Sarah. "Sometimes I wonder what I was thinking, choosing him over all my other suitors." As David retreated to the bedroom to change for work, he caught his reflection in the cracked mirror hanging on the wall. The face that looked back at him was weathered, lined with the evidence of hard labor and harder words. But in his eyes, There was something stirring, a small ember that had been smoldering for far too long, waiting for just the right moment to catch flame. Outside, the township was coming to life. Women in smart business attire walked to taxi ranks with confident strides, their heels clicking on the pavement. Men shuffled alongside them or behind them, their shoulders carrying invisible weights. In the shebeens that would fill up later, there would be quiet conversations among men who had learned to swallow their pride with their beer. But change, David thought as he buttoned his worn workshirt, often came from the most unexpected places. And sometimes, silence could only last so long before it transformed into something louder, something that couldn't be ignored. Something like thunder. The community center buzzed with energy as preparations for Mama Malonga's Umembiso ceremony reached their peak. Women in colorful traditional attire moved between tables laden with food, their voices rising in song and laughter. The ceremony was meant to honor the Malonga family's ancestors and celebrate their heritage, and Grace had spared no expense, though no expense meant draining what little savings David had managed to hide away for their daughter's school fees. David arrived early, as instructed, carrying boxes of supplies from the car. His white shirt was already stained with sweat despite the morning coolness, and his hands ached from the extra shifts he'd taken to help pay for the ceremony. Grace had given him a list of tasks: arrange the chairs, set up the sound system, organize the gift table, prepare the traditional beer, coordinate with the caterers. "You're late," Grace said when she arrived 30 minutes later, though he'd been there since dawn. She looked resplendent in a red and gold traditional dress that had cost more than his monthly salary. "And why are the chairs arranged like this?" "I specifically said semicircle, not rows. The elders said they preferred." "Do I look like I care what the elders said? My name is on this ceremony. My reputation. Move them. Now." David glanced at the 50 chairs he'd already arranged. His back throbbed, but he said nothing. He simply began moving them, one by one, while Grace supervised with her arms crossed. Sarah arrived with Thomas trailing behind, carrying her bags. "Grace, the dress is gorgeous." She air-kissed Grace's cheeks, then noticed David struggling with the chairs. "Oh my, you're making him do all the setup? Thomas, look how Grace has her household in order." Thomas said nothing, but David caught his eye, a brief moment of shared understanding before they both looked away. More guests began arriving. David recognized relatives he barely knew, people who'd ignored him at previous family gatherings but now expected his service. An uncle clapped him hard on the back. "David, good man. Get me a beer, eh?" He fetched the beer. An aunt called him over. "David, my chair is in the sun. Move it to the shade." He moved the chair. Grace's cousin arrived with her husband, a successful businessman. "Grace tells us you're still at the construction site," the cousin said, her voice dripping with pity. "That must be so difficult. My Robert just got promoted to regional manager." She squeezed her husband's arm possessively. David excused himself to check on the catering, but Grace's voice followed him. "And he still hasn't fixed the leaking tap at home. I've asked him 50 times. 50. But does he listen?" Laughter erupted behind him. Inside the kitchen area, David found Thomas helping to arrange plates. The two men worked in silence for a moment before Thomas spoke quietly. "How do you do it?" "Do what?" "This. Every day. I see how she talks to you. How they all talk to you." David kept his eyes on the plates. "What choice do I have? You could leave. And go where? With what money? And what about Lorotto?" David shook his head. "No. I stay. I endure. That's what men like us do." Thomas nodded slowly. "Sarah says I should be grateful she tolerates me. That most women wouldn't put up with a man who earns as little as I do." Before David could respond, Grace appeared in the doorway. "David, the photographer is asking about the family portrait setup. Why haven't you organized that yet? And Thomas, Sarah is looking for you. Something about holding her purse." Both men moved immediately, two shadows responding to the voices of their masters. The ceremony began with traditional songs and prayers. Mama Malongu sat in a place of honor, a regal woman in her 70s whose presence commanded respect. David noticed how she watched everything with sharp eyes, especially how Grace interacted with him. "My son," she had whispered to him earlier, gripping his hand with surprising strength, "you don't have to accept this. Your father would turn in his grave." But David had simply smiled and told her not to worry. What else could he say? The ceremony progressed beautifully. Elders spoke about family, respect, and the importance of maintaining dignity. Children performed traditional dances. The food was praised, the decorations admired. Grace glowed in the center of it all, accepting compliments, taking credit for every detail. David stood to the side, invisible until someone needed something. "David, more drinks at table 3. He fetched drinks. "David, the sound system is too loud." He adjusted the volume. "David, where is the guest book?" He found the guest book. Then came the speeches. This was the moment Grace had been planning for weeks, the chance to address the community, to cement her status as a successful woman who'd elevated her family through sheer will and determination. Mama Malongu spoke first, her voice strong despite her age. "Today we honor our ancestors and our family. We remember that a home is built on mutual respect, on partnership, on seeing each other as equals before God." Her eyes found David's, and he felt his throat tighten. "My husband, God rest his soul, used to say that a marriage is like two oxen pulling a cart. If one ox carries all the weight while the other is whipped for being weak, the cart will never reach its destination." A few people shifted uncomfortably. Grace's smile became fixed. "But I won't dwell on philosophy," Mama Malongu continued. "Today is about celebration. I'm grateful for my family, for my son, and for this gathering." Polite applause followed as she sat down. Grace rose to speak next, and the crowd fell silent. She was known for her eloquence, her commanding presence. "I want to thank everyone for coming to honor my mother-in-law," she began, her voice carrying across the room. "It hasn't been easy, building a life with limited resources, carrying the burden of being the primary provider in this household." David's hands clenched at his sides. "Some of us," Grace continued, warming to her theme, "are blessed with ambitious partners. Others of us must be the ambition for two people." Light laughter rippled through some of the guests. "But I persevere. I carry this family forward, even when the weight falls solely on my shoulders." Sarah began clapping, and others joined in, though David noticed several elders shaking their heads slightly. Mama Malonga's face had turned to stone. "My husband," Grace turned to look directly at him, her smile not reaching her eyes. "He tries. He really does. But trying and succeeding are two different things, aren't they?" More uncomfortable laughter. "Just last week, I had to explain to him how to properly pay a bill at the municipal office. Can you imagine? A grown man who can't even." She paused, building the moment, clearly expecting more laughter. David stood perfectly still. Something inside him had gone very quiet, very cold. His hands, which had been clenched, slowly relaxed. His breathing slowed. He looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw a stranger performing for an audience, using his dignity as her punchline. Around him, the world seemed to slow down. He saw Thomas's face, creased with familiar pain. He saw Sarah smirking, enjoying the show. He saw young couples watching, learning that this was normal, acceptable, even praiseworthy. He saw his daughter Lorotto in the corner, her young face confused, trying to understand why everyone was laughing at her father. And he saw Mama Malongu, tears streaming down her weathered cheeks, mourning the man her son had become, or rather, the man he'd stopped being. "And yesterday," Grace continued, emboldened by the attention, "yesterday he couldn't even start the lawnmower. Had to call the neighbor to help him. Can you believe it? The neighbor. I sometimes wonder what I saw in." David took a step forward. Just one step. But something in that movement made Grace stop mid-sentence. The room sensed it too, a shift in the atmosphere, like the pressure drop before a storm. David opened his mouth to speak. The silence in the room was absolute. Every eye was on David as he stood there, one step closer to his wife, his mouth open, ready to speak words that had been building for 15 years. Grace's smile had frozen on her face. For the first time, uncertainty flickered in her eyes. David, sit down. You're embarrassing yourself. But David didn't move. He looked at her, really looked at her, and then his gaze swept across the room. He saw the faces of his neighbors, his relatives, his daughter hiding in the corner. He saw Mama Malongu with tears streaming down her face. He saw Thomas, standing a little straighter now, waiting. When David finally spoke, his voice was quiet. So quiet that people leaned forward to hear. Enough. Just one word. But it fell into the room like a stone into still water, sending ripples in every direction. Grace blinked, momentarily speechless. What did you say? I said enough. David's voice grew stronger. Enough of the insults. Enough of the humiliation. Enough of teaching our daughter that love looks like this. David, this is not the time. Then when is the time, Grace? He stepped closer, and she actually took a step back. When would be a good time to tell you that you've broken me? That every morning I wake up and dread coming home? That I work myself to exhaustion not because we need the money, but because it gives me a few hours away from your tongue? Gasps rippled through the crowd. Sarah's smirk had vanished. Thomas had moved forward, his eyes wide. You will sit down right now, Grace hissed, her voice low and dangerous. You're making a scene at your mother's ceremony. No. David shook his head slowly. You made a scene. You've been making a scene for 15 years. Every breakfast where you list my failures. Every dinner where you remind me how much you earn compared to me. Every gathering where I become your punchline. His voice cracked. I'm just finally responding. Grace's face had gone red. How dare you? How dare I? David's voice rose, and people in the back rows stood up to see better. How dare I expect basic human dignity in my own home? How dare I ask to be treated with the same respect I give you every single day? Respect. Grace's voice was shrill now. You want respect? Earn it. Provide like a man should provide. Stop being so weak. Is that what you think? David's eyes glistened with unshed tears. That I'm weak because I don't match your salary? That I'm less of a man because I work with my hands instead of in an office? I didn't say. You've said it 1,000 times. In 1,000 different ways. David's voice thundered now, and people jumped. Just last week, you told your friends I was basically useless. Last month, you laughed when Sarah said I was Grace's biggest mistake. Yesterday, you told Lorotto that she should study hard so she doesn't end up dependent on a man like your father. A collective gasp went through the room. Several women covered their mouths. Lorotto, their 12-year-old daughter, ran from the room crying. That's not, I didn't mean, Grace stammered. Yes, you did. David's voice broke. You meant every word. Every insult. Every casual cruelty. Every public humiliation. He held up his hands, calloused, scarred from years of construction work. These hands built the extension on our house. These hands fixed every broken thing we own because we couldn't afford to hire help. These hands held you when you cried about your mother's illness. These hands held our daughter when she was born. Tears were streaming down his face now. But somewhere along the way, my wife, you looked at these hands and saw failure. You looked at me and saw nothing but what I wasn't instead of seeing what I was. Mama Malongu stood up, her voice ringing clear. David. No, Mama. David held up a hand. Let me finish. I need to finish. He turned back to Grace. For 15 years, I have endured. I swallowed my pride, my pain, my humanity, because I believed that keeping peace was more important than keeping my dignity. I told myself that you were stressed, that times were hard, that your words didn't really mean anything. His voice dropped to almost a whisper. But they meant everything. They meant that you stopped seeing me as your partner and started seeing me as your problem. They meant that our daughter is growing up believing that this is what love looks like, one person destroying another slowly, word by word, day by day. Grace's eyes were filling with tears now, but whether from shame or anger, no one could tell. I love you, David said, and his voice cracked completely. God help me, I still love you. But I won't be your punching bag anymore. I won't be your example of failure to laugh about with your friends. I won't teach our daughter that a man should accept being treated as less than human just to keep a woman happy. He turned to address the entire room, his voice gaining strength. And to everyone here who has watched this happen, who has laughed along, who has accepted this as normal, shame on us. Shame on all of us. His eyes found Thomas, then moved to other men in the room. We've taught our sons that enduring abuse is strength. We've taught our daughters that success means you can treat people badly. We've confused liberation with revenge. Pastor Mbeki stood up, his face grave. Brother David speaks truth. Truth. Sarah jumped up, her voice sharp. He's being dramatic. Grace works hard, she deserves to. To what? Thomas's voice cut through, surprising everyone, especially Sarah. To humiliate her husband? To destroy him publicly? Is that what success earns you? He looked at his wife with eyes that suddenly held something dangerous. Is that what you think you deserve? Sarah's mouth opened and closed like a fish. My father, David continued, his voice steady now despite the tears, used to say that a person's true character shows in how they treat those who can do nothing for them. Grace, I can do nothing for you that you can't do for yourself. You don't need my money. You don't need my status. The only thing I have to offer is my love, my partnership, my humanity. He paused. And you've spent 15 years telling me that's not enough. David, please. Grace's voice was small now, frightened. Is it enough, Grace? David asked. Am I enough? Not my salary, not my job title, not my ability to match your success. Just me. Am I enough? The question hung in the air like smoke. Grace stood frozen, tears running down her face, her mouth opening but no words coming out. David waited. The entire room waited. When no answer came, David nodded slowly, as if confirming something he'd always known. That's what I thought. He looked at his mother. Mama, I'm sorry I ruined your ceremony. You didn't ruin anything, my son, Mama Malongu said, her voice thick with emotion. You honored it. You honored what it was supposed to be about. Dignity, respect, truth. David walked toward the door, then paused and turned back one last time. For any man here who's been afraid to speak, who's swallowed his pride to keep peace, who's let himself be diminished, you're not weak. You're not worthless. You're not the failure they've told you that you are. His voice grew stronger. And for any woman here who's used success as a weapon, who's confused empowerment with cruelty, who's forgotten that lifting yourself up doesn't require pushing someone else down, you can do better. You must do better. He walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click that sounded like thunder. For a full minute, no one moved. No one spoke. The room was filled with 200 people, and you could have heard a pin drop. Then Thomas walked out after David. Then another man. Then another. Until finally, nearly every man in the room had filed out, leaving their wives and girlfriends staring after them in shock. Grace collapsed into a chair, her body shaking with sobs. Sarah sat down heavily beside her, all her usual confidence gone. Other women looked at each other, confusion and fear written on their faces. Outside, in the parking lot, the men gathered around David. No one spoke at first. They just stood there, a silent brotherhood of men who had finally heard someone say what they'd all been thinking. Thank you, Thomas finally said, his voice rough. Thank you for being brave enough to speak. David leaned against a car, exhausted, trembling. I don't feel brave. I feel terrified. That's what courage is, Pastor Mbeki said, coming out to join them. Being terrified and speaking anyway. Inside, the women sat in stunned silence until Mama Malongu stood up. Ladies, she said, her voice cutting through the shock. We need to talk. Really talk. About what we've become. About what we've allowed to happen. About what kind of legacy we're leaving for our children. And so, as the sun climbed higher over Khayelitsha Township, two conversations began. One among the men standing in the parking lot, one among the women sitting in the community center. Both groups were finally ready to face the truth they'd been avoiding for far too long. Sometimes silence became thunder, not with a single word, but with the accumulated weight of thousands of unspoken truths finally breaking free. The Malonga house felt different in the days following the ceremony. The walls seemed to hold their breath, waiting for something, reconciliation or rupture, no one could say for sure. David had moved his things to the spare room, a silent statement that nothing would return to normal without real change. Grace sat at the kitchen table, the same table where she'd hurled countless insults over countless meals. But tonight, Mama Malongu sat across from her, and the older woman's presence commanded a different kind of conversation. Tell me, Mama Malongu said, pouring rooibos tea into 2 cups. When did you start believing that hurting him made you stronger? Grace's hands trembled around her cup. I never meant. Yes, you did. The words were firm but not unkind. You meant every word, every insult, every public humiliation. The question is why. In the spare room, David sat with Thomas and Pastor Mbeki. What had begun as a private conversation had evolved into something larger. Men gathering to share stories they'd kept locked away for years. She makes more money than me, one man admitted, his voice rough with shame. And somehow that became permission for her to make every decision, to question every choice I make, to remind me daily that I'm less than. My wife tells her friends I'm lazy, another said. But I work 12-hour shifts at the factory. I come home exhausted, and she's angry that I don't do more. David listened, recognizing his own story in each of theirs. The question isn't whether our wives work hard or whether they deserve respect for their success, he said slowly. The question is, when did we accept that respect is a limited resource? That lifting women up meant pushing men down. Thomas nodded. My grandfather used to say that a home should be like 2 legs walking. Equal strength, equal steps, moving together. When did we forget that? Back in the kitchen, Mama Malongu was pressing harder. You work in human resources, Grace. You fight for workplace dignity, for fair treatment, for respect. But you come home and treat your husband like he's less than human. How do you reconcile that? Grace's tears fell freely now. I don't know. I was so angry. Angry at what? At everything. The words burst out of her. At growing up poor, at watching my mother beg my father for everything, at being told girls should be quiet and grateful. When I got my degree, when I got my job, I swore I'd never be powerless like my mother. So you became the oppressor, Mama Malongu said quietly. You took your pain and passed it on. But David isn't like my father. No, he's not. And you're not like your mother. But you've been punishing him for crimes he never committed, using your success as a weapon instead of a tool for building something better. Outside, the township was experiencing its own reckoning. Sarah had called a meeting of the women's group at the community center, but the atmosphere was nothing like their usual gatherings. No laughter, no gossip, no casual cruelty disguised as jokes. We need to talk about what happened, Sarah said, standing before a room full of women who had cheered on Grace's public humiliation of David countless times. We need to talk about what we've become. A woman named Linda stood up. What we've become. We've become successful. Independent. We don't need to apologize for that. No one's asking you to apologize for success, a younger woman named Joy replied. But success and cruelty aren't the same thing. I'm building my career, and my husband supports me. We support each other. That's what partnership looks like. Easy for you to say, another woman scoffed. You don't know what it was like before, when women had nothing. And now some of us have turned never again into now it's your turn to suffer, Sarah said quietly. I've spent 20 years making my husband feel small because I was afraid that if he felt big, I'd become small again. But that's not how it works. We've been operating from the same fear and pain that oppressed our mothers, just pointed in a different direction. The room fell silent. Back at the Malonga house, David and Grace finally sat down together. Mama Malongo had retreated to the living room, but her presence was still felt, a witness to whatever would unfold. I'm sorry, Grace said, and this time the words carried weight. I'm sorry for every insult, every public humiliation, every time I made you feel less than human. I'm sorry for teaching our daughter that this is what love looks like. David's jaw tightened. Why, Grace? Why did you do it? Because I was afraid, she admitted. Afraid that if I wasn't in control of everything, if I wasn't the strong one, the powerful one, I'd end up like my mother, dependent, voiceless, trapped. So you trapped me instead. Yes. The admission hung in the air. And I told myself it was different because you're a man, because men had all the power for so long, because I was just evening the scales. But that's not what I was doing. I was just hurting you. And I'm ashamed. Shame isn't enough, David said, echoing his words from the ceremony. I need to know if you're capable of seeing me as an equal. Not beneath you. Not above you. Equal. Grace looked at him, really looked at him, perhaps for the first time in years. I want to be, she said. I want to learn how to be powerful without being cruel. I want to teach our daughter something better than what I learned. Then we start there, David said. We start with honesty, with respect, with building something new instead of perpetuating old pain. As dawn broke over Khayelitsha, something fundamental had shifted. Not just in the Malongo household, but across the township. Men were speaking up in homes where silence had reigned. Women were questioning behaviors they'd accepted as normal. Couples were having difficult conversations, some ending in tears, some in laughter, some in the tentative steps of reconciliation. Change, it turned out, was not a single dramatic moment but a series of small choices made every day. To listen instead of dismiss, to build up instead of tear down, to remember that true strength lies not in dominating another person but in lifting both people higher. 6 months had passed since the ceremony that changed everything. The Malongo household had become something of a pilgrimage site, though David and Grace never intended it that way. Couples came seeking advice, asking questions, wanting to know the secret formula for transformation. But there was no formula, Grace would tell them. Just hard work, painful honesty, and the daily choice to do better. On a Saturday afternoon, the community center hosted a gathering unlike any before. Men and women filled the space, but this time, there were no separate groups, no invisible walls. Pastor Mbeki stood at the front, but the real speakers were the couples who had fought their way back from the brink. David and Grace sat together, their hands linked, a small gesture that represented countless hours of conversation, therapy sessions with a counselor from the township clinic, and the slow rebuilding of trust. Someone asked me last week, David began, addressing the crowd, if I regret speaking up that day. If I regret causing such a scene at my mother's ceremony. He paused, looking at Grace. The answer is no. I regret staying silent for 15 years. I regret teaching my daughter that love looks like enduring humiliation. I regret losing myself trying to keep peace. Grace squeezed his hand. And I regret weaponizing my success, she added. I regret believing that empowerment meant overpowering someone else. My mother suffered under patriarchy, and instead of breaking that cycle, I just reversed it. That's not liberation. That's just revenge. Thomas and Sarah sat in the front row. Their transformation had been perhaps even more dramatic than the Malangas. Sarah had resigned from a promotion that would have meant more time away from home, choosing instead to invest in their relationship. Thomas had enrolled in night classes, pursuing a degree he'd abandoned years ago. Together, they were redefining what partnership meant. "We lost our way," Sarah said when it was their turn to speak. "Somewhere between fighting for equality and finding success, some of us confused power with cruelty. We thought that being strong meant making others weak." Pastor Mbeki stepped forward. "What we're witnessing in Khayelitsha is a new kind of revolution. Not the revolution of the oppressed rising up, but the revolution of the empowered learning humanity. It's messier, more complicated, but ultimately more profound." A younger couple, married just 2 years, raised their hands. "How do we make sure we don't end up where you were?" the woman asked. Grace leaned forward. "By remembering that you're on the same team. Your husband's dignity doesn't diminish yours. His success doesn't threaten yours. In fact, the stronger you both are, the stronger your home becomes." "And by talking," David added, "before the resentment builds, before the words become weapons, before you forget that the person across from you is human, deserving of the same respect you demand for yourself." The gathering continued for hours, stories spilling out like rain after a drought. An elderly woman spoke about her marriage of 40 years, admitting that she'd treated her husband poorly after he lost his job in the 1990s. "I told myself I was just being strong," she said, tears running down her face. "But I was just being mean. And now he's gone, and I can't take back those words." Her story moved through the crowd like a wave, and David saw several women reach for their husbands' hands, saw several men straighten their shoulders with newfound dignity. But it wasn't just about marriage. Young people spoke up too, talking about what they'd learned from watching their parents' struggles. A teenage girl stood up. "I'm top of my class," she said. "And I used to think that meant I should look down on boys who weren't as smart. But that's not strength. That's just being cruel. We can be successful without being mean." Her words earned applause, and David felt something loosen in his chest. Maybe his public breakdown had been worth it after all. Maybe exposing his pain had planted seeds for a different kind of future. As the gathering wound down, Mama Malongu stood to speak. At 80 years old, she commanded respect simply by existing, and the room fell silent. "I was born in 1945, she began. "I've seen apartheid, I've seen the struggle, I've seen liberation. I've seen women fight for every right they now have. And I celebrate that. Every single victory." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room. "But liberation means freedom for everyone. It means building a world where no one has to be diminished for another to rise. My son found his voice that day because he finally understood that silence wasn't peace, it was slow death. And my daughter-in-law found her humanity when she realized that power without compassion is just another form of oppression." She moved to stand between David and Grace, placing a hand on each of their shoulders. "These two have shown us that transformation is possible, that we can break cycles of pain instead of perpetuating them, that we can choose every single day to treat each other with dignity." The applause that followed was thunderous, but it was the quiet conversations afterward that mattered most. Couples walking out together, talking earnestly. Mothers pulling sons aside to apologize. Fathers embracing daughters they'd been too proud to admit they'd hurt. Later that evening, as the sun set over Khayelitsha, David and Grace stood on their small porch, watching the township settle into night. Their daughter, Lorotto, sat between them, doing homework. "Mama," she asked without looking up, "why were you and Papa not happy before?" Grace and David exchanged glances. They'd known this question would come eventually. "Because we forgot how to be kind to each other," Grace said simply. "We forgot that being strong doesn't mean being mean." "And I forgot," David added, "that staying quiet when someone hurts you isn't strength either. Real strength is speaking your truth with love and expecting to be treated with dignity." Lorotto nodded, processing this. "I'm glad you remembered," she said, returning to her homework. In that moment, David understood that the real victory wasn't just in changing his marriage or even in sparking conversations across the township. It was in ensuring that his daughter would enter the world knowing that love looked like mutual respect, that power meant lifting each other up, that true partnership meant walking together as equals. Thunder had rolled through Khayelitsha that day 6 months ago, loud and unavoidable. But thunder, David had learned, was just the announcement of rain, the rain that nourished new growth, that washed away old pain, that made fresh starts possible. And in a township where silence had been mistaken for peace and cruelty for strength, the rain was still falling, and something beautiful was beginning to bloom. The transformation is complete. From humiliation to healing, from silence to strength. If this story moved your spirit, smash that like button and subscribe to Folktales by Inayah. Comment below. What's the most important lesson from David and Grace's journey? Who do you know that needs to hear this story? Share this message of hope and healing. Hit that notification bell for more powerful folktales that teach, inspire, and transform. Thank you for being part of this community.